On Friday, July the 16th, a routine flight in a private plane to Martha's Vineyard took off from Caldwell Airport in New Jersey. The pilot was John Kennedy Jr., and the passengers were his wife, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister, Lauren. 58 minutes later, they were all dead. We retraced their last hours and the fatal sequence of events which led to this terrible tragedy. Friday, July the 16th, 6 p.m., the worst time to leave New York City. John Kennedy Jr. sets out from his offices in central Manhattan to fly to a weekend family wedding in Hyannisport. With him is his sister-in-law, Lauren Bessette, who's to be dropped off on the way at Martha's Vineyard. When they finally leave town, they hit the rush hour head-on. Just ahead of them is pilot Bob Arnott, who's also planning to fly that evening to his holiday home in Nantucket.
That particular afternoon, I was in this office at about 6:15 in the evening. Now, I left here roughly the same time and found the worst traffic in probably 15 years of driving. It took us, rather than the usual 20 minutes, nearly an hour and a half. And so for myself, and I would assume for John, it turned what would have been a very pleasant daytime flight into a nighttime flight.
Earlier that day at 4 p.m., John's wife Carolyn Kennedy shops for a designer dress to wear at the wedding at Saks Fifth Avenue. John and Carolyn were America's most glamorous couple. Though their 2.5-year marriage had been plagued by rumors of rows, false pregnancies and family fallouts, they now seemed happier than ever.
Carolyn did not in any way kowtow to John. What they had was an ongoing give and take kind of repartee, very amusing, very entertaining.
Bob Arnott had known the Kennedy family for some time.
You know, it certainly seemed to be a stormy relationship, which is what many of us have in our first year of marriage, where it's sort of a love-hate relationship, and I think that's sort of what we saw on the outside. But my understanding is that on the inside, that he deeply loved her and was quite upset should there be any sort of hostility within the relationship. It was a relationship he really wanted to make work, loved her very much.
John, I mean, in my experience, he would not arrive in a chauffeur-driven limousine. He'd step off his 10-speed bike. When he came to a meeting, he was dressed informally. He was one of the guys. People in New York regularly saw him gallivanting around Central Park on rollerblades or running around the reservoir on the track.
John Jr. had spent the day working at his office on Broadway. He was editor of the political magazine George, launched in a blaze of publicity in 1995. Though the magazine had had some problems, things were now starting to look up. Around 6:45 p.m., Carolyn travelled to the airport separately in a black limo. Kyle Bailey was unloading his car and was planning to fly that evening. He saw the Kennedy party as they made their final preparations.
I was, planning the same flight around that same time period, and I was actually by my car in my trunk, arranging some things around, and it caught my attention when I saw John pull up in his white Hyundai convertible around 8 o'clock. Every time I've seen them, it's usually around Friday, around between maybe 5:30 and 6. This was, I think it would be safe to say, a little bit late for them. Everything seemed normal. They were just walking around the ramp, conversing to one another. I mean, it looked like just a routine flight.
John Kennedy briefly left the airport to pick up some supplies for the journey from the garage over the road. Eyewitnesses there say that he appeared to be in no particular hurry, even stopping to browse at the magazines on the way out.
Shortly thereafter, I remember hearing the engine run up, which is part of the pre-flight check on the airplane.
At the heart of this story are the two different ways that pilots fly aircraft. At first, all pilots learn to fly by visual flight rules, or VFR, orientating themselves by what they see around them. But the next and more difficult stage is flying by instrument flight rules, or IFR. They have to rely on what their instruments tell them. To fly safely in poor visibility, when the horizon is obscured and there's no sense of up or down, the hardest task is trusting the instruments and ignoring what your instincts are telling you. At 8:20 the same night, Bob Arnott took off from a nearby airport. Crucially, he left 15 minutes before the Kennedy plane, and at that time, the weather reports were clear.
The radar traces, the satellite trace, all of the predicted weather looked like a clean bill of health. On the way out of here, I called flight service from a cell phone about 15 minutes from takeoff. And I said, "Are there any adverse conditions?" They said, "There are no adverse conditions. Have a good weekend." Which is very surprising because usually flight briefers will say, "Well, you know, maybe there's a problem here. There could be a little fog, or we're worried about the dew point spread." I ordinarily will have an IFR instrument flight plan on file just in case there's something that could come up, a little fog, reduced visibility, but was given such clear assurances that there would be absolutely no problem that I had no instrument flight plan.
But it was a very different story just 15 minutes later at the airport where Kennedy was going to take off. As Kyle Bailey checked his aircraft, he was becoming concerned about visibility.
The visibility was, I would estimate, to be about 4 miles, and the sky was extremely hazy.
Even at Kennedy International Airport, 30 miles away, the worsening visibility was apparent to air traffic controller Barrett Burns.
Actually, I was working here at JFK that Friday night, and it was a very, very hazy night. And when you do not have any illumination from the moon, it was a new moon, you're going to get that, that darkness.
Eyewitness Kyle Bailey was beginning to doubt the wisdom of his own flight, while John Kennedy made his pre-flight checks.
I actually planned to make the same flight he was making from Caldwell to Martha's Vineyard. I was debating on going either Friday night or Saturday morning. And based on the weather conditions at the airport at that time, I decided I think it would be the best bet to go on Saturday morning. I felt the conditions were a little bit marginal. I mean, I probably could have made the trip, but it would have been tough. It's difficult at night because of the fog tends to roll in so quickly on the island. You could have clear skies, right now, and then 10 minutes later the fog will roll in and you'll have zero visibility. And plus at night you're over water. In a single engine airplane, you really have to, be on top of the airplane, and I mean, I would not go unless I had ideal conditions.
8:38 p.m. Kyle Bailey made the decision to abandon his journey. He saw the Kennedy's plane take off for the Vineyard. It was the last time they were ever seen alive.
The T-bar on a Friday night in the height of summer. 4 blokes. Odds, Mr. Jones? Slim? Let's do it anyway.
Hello there. Greetings, doorman. My associates and I wish to enter your establishment and partake of some beverages.
Better come in then.
I thank you.
I'm a footballer, not a movie star. I just want to feel good about the way I look.
L'Oreal Elvive 2-in-1. It contains ceramide R, which strengthens the hair from within.
For stronger, thicker, healthy-looking hair.
L'Oreal Elvive 2-in-1 with ceramide R.
It's L'Oreal and I'm worth it.
There's a unique hydration system that provides your skin with a source of water throughout the day. The all-day water source that brings your skin to life. New Aqua Source from Imperial Leather.
Referee, who gets the flack? The man in black. Referee, getting verbal abuse from an 8-foot goose. Referee, when the OSHA fixes we to fix that gets me through. 'Cause a ref's gotta do what a ref.
Have you had your Weetabix?
All right.
Wow.
No, that one's mine, that ain't yours.
Why?
Well, I peeled all the potatoes, I chipped them, you know, fried them, and nearly burnt myself.
Fine.
It's all right, there's plenty there for you. That chip pan, it's scrubbed, you wouldn't know I'd used it.
What chip pan?
What chip?
Begin home fries. You just can't help yourself.
The latest breakthrough from Finish works like an overnight soak in minutes. New Finish Powerball tabs with stain soakers are ultimate finish.
Warner Brothers presents
West.
Jim West, Will Smith, Kevin Kline,
From the director of Men in Black.
Wild Wild West.
It's a big payday for us today. Let's get lucky.
Peter Weller, Dennis Hopper, Top of the World tonight at 9 on 5.
John Jr. learned to fly at America's top aviation school in Florida. He got his pilot's license in 1998 and was halfway through his instrument training. Experienced flyers say he was at the stage in a pilot's career where he knew just enough to be dangerous. And what's more, he'd just had a plaster cast removed from the ankle that had broken in a paragliding accident.
I'd spoken to him on July 7th. That was the last time I spoke with him. It was 9 days before he died. We were looking for a common day in which to meet to discuss an article that that he'd wanted me to do for George. And I said, how about Friday, July 16th? At which point he said, I can't do it that day because I've got to go to my cousin Rory's wedding. As a matter of fact, he said, I've got to fly my sister-in-law first and drop her off at Martha's Vineyard and then fly back to Hyannisport. So I said, well, I've read that you're quite an accomplished pilot by this time. And he said, quite to the contrary. I'm no Charlie Lindbergh, and you know, landing twice for me is twice as difficult as landing once, and no one in the family has ever agreed to fly with me except my wife, and it took me months to convince her.
Nobody really knows the details of what happened on board Kennedy's plane that night, but radar reports recorded at the time and released later tracked his movements as he made his way to the Vineyard. John Jr. was flying the high-performance Piper Saratoga he'd bought second-hand in April for $385,000. Known as the sports utility vehicle of the skies, this was a big step up from the less luxurious Cessna he'd previously owned. 9:15 p.m. Kennedy's Piper was making its way along the Connecticut shore. He had around 300 hours of flying experience, but less than 50 in this plane. Nor was he fully qualified to fly on instruments alone. With poor visibility and no sight of the horizon, pilots have to rely on their instruments to get their bearings. Chuck Leonard has investigated more than 200 air accidents, many of them in the waters surrounding Martha's Vineyard.
Well, what he was doing, I believe, when he left New Jersey was to fly along the coastline of Connecticut so that he would be over land as long as he could, which was a prudent thing to do. The problems, I think, began when he turned towards Martha's Vineyard and began his descent and lose sight of the lights.
Like 98% of private pilots, Kennedy hadn't filed a flight plan. If he were to run into problems, air traffic controllers like Kathy Pritchard, based at Stewart Airport in upstate New York, wouldn't be able to track his movements as he flew.
A VFR pilot is not required to file a VFR flight plan, but usually it's highly recommended.
Stortel, you're not in sight. Runway 9er, wind currently 360 at 9er, clear to land.
If you don't file a flight plan, the only people that aren't going to know that you arrived where you're supposed to be are probably the people that are waiting for you. Then it would probably be up to them to start making phone calls to specific individuals of where you departed to find out if you have left or not. Because if you don't file, then the air traffic system has no record and is unable to identify where you are.
Bob Arnott's aircraft flew over Martha's Vineyard just before the Kennedy plane. It was at this stage that the visibility was to change dramatically.
I took off from Teterboro, which is only about 7 or 8 miles from Caldwell, where he took off from. And it's basically the same flight plan route because you have to go slightly north of LaGuardia to make your way up and around and out Long Island Sound. Wonderful takeoff. We could see all the buildings in Manhattan, nice visibility, nothing that would give you any sense that there might be a problem. Beautiful sunset, clear, crisp horizon, not a cloud in sight, no thunderstorms, nothing. But as I descended just south of Martha's Vineyard by, I would estimate, about 3 miles, there was no Martha's Vineyard to be seen. It was so inky and murky and black outside that there was no horizon, there were no stars to be seen, there were no ships to be seen, no ocean, in fact, absolutely nothing.
Well, he was approaching the island from the west. The little towns that are on Martha's Vineyard are in the eastern side of that island, and so there are lights over there, but there are very few lights on the western side of that island.
And I would say that at this point in time, that if one were not an experienced seasoned instrument pilot with an instrument rating and many, many hours up in the air, it would be extremely easy to get disoriented. That is, if you let the airplane drift, as often happens just a little bit, it would be imperceptible. You have no sense that it drifted. Then the nose would drop, and at that point, just like seeing a child in front of your car and stepping on the brake, you want to pull back on the control column. Well, what happens when you pull back is you tighten up the turn, and you go into a spiral that doesn't take minutes to develop, but seconds.
We can only imagine what took place in the Kennedy cockpit that night. Though this was a regular trip for John, there was one vital difference this time. Instead of flying straight to Hyannisport, he had to land first at Martha's Vineyard to drop off his sister-in-law, Lauren Bassett. As the aircraft began its approach to the airstrip, it was flying over water on a black, moonless night with no lights for guidance. 17 miles from the Vineyard, the plane started to make some erratic movements. Experts suggest John Kennedy may have lost sight of the horizon and was becoming disorientated, a condition commonly known as black hole vertigo.
All it would take was a slight movement of the head to look away and then go back to the windshield again and look out, and your mind plays tricks on you as far as your inner ear, and it actually will tell the pilot that they're not straight and level, and so the pilot will try to overcorrect that situation. It's a shame because all the pilot really has to do is let go of the controls and the aircraft will right itself, but the pilot will try to overcorrect it, and unfortunately in this situation, since their mind is playing tricks on them, they can actually be turning that aircraft over in an inverted situation. And when that happens, the airplane's engine begins to race uncontrollably. Pilots are taught when the engine RPMs go up, pull back on the stick. If you're inverted, you pull back, you go down into a dive.
Bob Arnott has first-hand experience of black hole vertigo from when his flying instructor put his plane into a dive as part of his training.
When you go through the first 1,000 feet, you're already down to a vertical velocity of 4,000 to 5,000 feet per minute, which is roughly what the radar traces showed for him. The most disconcerting thing is that you're pulling a large G-load, which means that you have the G-forces of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times the force of gravity. So I could actually feel my face sort of pulling back like this. But in addition, you have centrifugal forces which are pulling your head out to the side of the aircraft. So you're being pushed back like a space launch, but your head is also knocking on the side from the centrifugal forces. So this makes you feel very physically ill. It's very disconcerting. You really feel something is terribly, terribly wrong. And you can imagine that in a total sort of black void, with your instrument spinning around, that even for a very seasoned pilot, it would be almost impossible to recover.
9:39 p.m. Radar information shows that at 2,300 feet, the plane suddenly turns right, heading away from the island, and then climbs to 2,600 feet. A minute and 20 seconds later, the plane descends to 2,200 feet, and then continues to drop at 10 times normal speed.
With a bank already established, then what happens is the bank just continues to get tighter and tighter and steeper and steeper. And essentially, there's no recovery from that maneuver at that point, at that low altitude.
Just 14 seconds later, the last radar signal recorded shows the aircraft at 1,000 feet and plummeting towards the sea. When the plane crashed off the west coast of Martha's Vineyard, it was heading away from the airport, suggesting that Kennedy had completely lost his way. Shortly afterwards, a phone conversation was recorded between a Martha's Vineyard employee, Adam Budd, and the Federal Aviation Administration.
Good evening, Bridgeport Flight Service.
Hi, I was wondering if you could track an airplane for me. Would you know about Teterboro or Westchester? There's 2 tail numbers.
Okay, now, what's this all about? Who are you?
That's en route from Martha's Vineyard Airport.
Well, who are you?
I'm with Airport Operations.
From where?
Martha's Vineyard Airport.
Okay.
Actually, Kennedy Jr.'s on board. They want to know where he is.
Well,
Friends waiting for Lauren Bassett were worried she was late and had asked Bud to make inquiries on their behalf.
Yeah, there's 2 of them. It's either 529JK or 9253N.
Okay, well, we don't give this information out to people over the phone.
Okay, well, if it's too much trouble,
Okie doke.
I'll just have them wait.
What?
All right, it's not a big deal.
All right.
Take it easy.
The inquiry wasn't pressed further. 4 hours later, at 2:15 a.m., the Coast Guard was alerted. At 3:28 a.m., a search and rescue operation was launched when the first boat was sent out. Because no flight plan had been filed, air traffic controllers weren't monitoring his flight.
There's very little monitoring of VFR traffic. If you are not talking to them and you do not know that they are out there, in essence, you could lose a target or an aircraft visually in sight and never know.
The search and rescue mission covered 9,000 square miles of water. 2 salvage vessels from the US Navy, several Coast Guard cutters, the Air Force, and even the National Guard were deployed in the vain hope of finding survivors.
You combine the vertical speed of 60 miles an hour or so with the straight-ahead speed of 200-300 miles an hour, it would be instant death. There'd be no chance of surviving that kind of wreck.
After 3 days, the search and rescue operation turned into one of search and recovery. The Kennedy plane was soon discovered by underwater cameras, lying 116 feet deep on the ocean floor, upside down, and with the 3 passengers still strapped in their seats. Autopsy reports suggest they died instantly. Initial reports from the National Transportation Safety Board state that there was no mechanical failure on the aircraft. Investigators recovered the black box from the cockpit, but it was so badly damaged the voice recordings were lost. Could Kennedy's injured foot have been a factor, preventing him from fully controlling his aircraft?
You could imagine that having a bad leg and trying to press down on a rudder would make it more difficult, and that there would be tremendous forces here, and that if he were weak or had too much pain with that leg, that it might have made it harder to bring the plane back around. But if that were true, he already would have had such high G-forces and centrifugal forces and airplane speed, it would be unlikely that he would have recovered the airplane.
Nearly 36 years ago, flags flew at half-mast for the father. Now they were lowered for the son. Once again, the Kennedy clan assembled to bury one of their own. John Kennedy Jr. was the 9th member of the dynasty to die in tragic circumstances. His sister Caroline is left without a father, a mother, or a brother. Americans took the tragedy to heart. For many, it felt like a personal loss. Not since the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, had there been such a public outpouring of grief.
There's this sense that, John Kennedy Jr. Lived half a life. He died at age 38, and yet people say, yeah, but in those 38 years he actually lived 5 lives. I mean, he did everything, knew everybody, went everywhere, experienced everything. People feel the immediacy of the tragedy because he was very popular, because he was one of the guys, and because he was good looking, and he was, a Hollywood figure almost, and he wasn't associated with any negative scandals, and so there was nothing but, goodness about him, and so the immediacy of his death has had a very poignant effect.
Did John Jr. make a fatal error of judgment by taking off on a moonless night in worsening weather without full instrument training?
In the United States, you are allowed to fly at night and not have an instrument rating because it's not considered instrument weather. In many parts of Europe and the Caribbean, you have to have an instrument flight plan. And that may be one shortcoming of the U.S. system. However, it's part of the doctrine of the flight school that he trained at that flying at night over water is de facto instrument flight. Now, he had a very good flight along the Connecticut and Rhode Island coast with no problem. Once he left westerly, he went out into a black inky void. And again, the top people at the company that he trained with say that flying over water at night is instrument conditions. And so you could say that flying at night like that, would have made a big, obviously did make a big difference. What is interesting is if he went directly to Hyannis, he probably never would have gone over water, or not very much water.
6 days after the plane was found and the bodies recovered, John, Carolyn and Lauren's ashes were scattered at sea in a private ceremony, echoing John F. Kennedy's words of 1962. "We are tied to the ocean. When we go back to the sea, we are going back from whence we came."